In this tutorial, we'll be covering ARM's AP workflow module, specifically the AI OCR add-on, and we'll show how these two pieces work together to provide a highly automated and efficient solution for the entry and processing of AP invoices. So to provide some context, this illustration shows the P2P process, that is, the purchasing process from its very beginnings as a purchase request or a requisition, which then moves through an approval process, ultimately becoming a purchase order. The purchase order is then sent out to the vendor and the goods or services received sometime later. AP invoices are then sent out, sometimes with the goods themselves or more commonly these days, emailed directly to a specific folder within your organization, and the invoices are then processed, posted, and paid. Now notice that the core ARM solution covers the process from requisition right the way through to PO receipt. The ARM AP workflow module handles the entry and the processing of AP invoices, while the invoice posting and payment steps are handled exclusively within Kinetic itself. Now, the processing of AP invoices involves several steps. Now, looking just at the AP process now, focusing on each of these steps, we begin with the invoice being created, and then if the invoice is attributed to a purchase order, then relevant receipt lines would then need to be matched to that invoice. Once they're matched, the invoice is submitted for approval, and once approved, the invoice is subsequently posted and paid. So notice once again that the ARM AP workflow module accommodates all steps up to the point at which the invoice is ready for posting and payment. So in summary, the AP workflow module is all about entering and approving AP invoices using ARM. And this process works fine for many organizations, but eventually there comes a point, especially where large volumes of invoicing is concerned, where it makes more sense to automate the process of creating, matching, and submitting invoices. And this is where the AI OCR piece comes into play. AI OCR is an automated process which works in conjunction with ARM's AP workflow module to automate the process of entering and submitting data. As the name suggests, AI OCR is able to scan and lift data from an invoice and use that data to drive further automation in ARM. AI OCR can also be trained when inaccuracies or anomalies appear from the initial scan. So the more it's trained, the more it learns and the more accurate it becomes. Electronically scanning a document and recognizing data, also known as OCR or optical character recognition, adds two additional steps to the AP invoice process. So firstly, and this is the green boxes, AI OCR picks up and scans the document, identifying and meta tagging key pieces of information on the page, such as vendor, totals, due dates, payment terms, taxes, shipping charges, etc. This data is then passed to ARM into a new menu screen known as the OCR dashboard. Now, at this point, note that the AP invoice has not yet been created. Invoice validation is simply that. It's a validation that the information that's been gathered from the AI OCR process is both accurate and complete. If it is, ARM will automatically generate, populate, and submit that AP invoice for approval. So ultimately, this means that provided the detail brought into the OCR dashboard is sufficient, your AP team will no longer need to manually key in header or line detail, nor will they have to go and manually match invoice lines to PO receipts. I mean, their job literally becomes one of exception handling. So the process with AI OCR incorporated into ARM AP workflow would be something like this. Unprocessed AP invoices, usually in PDF format, would be dropped into a folder which we know is the work list folder, and that's shown here in grey. Now, this could be a folder on a network, on a local machine. It could even be an email inbox if you so choose. So, for example, if you had a specific email address that all of your AP invoices get sent to. AI OCR will poll this folder periodically, and as we see in the green boxes, if it sees a new invoice enter that folder or that inbox, it picks it up, scans the detail, and sends that detail to ARM for validation. Now, if the detail is accurate and sufficient, as we said before, then we move on to those teal boxes there where ARM automatically creates the invoice for you, matches the invoice lines, and submits the document for approval. Of course, miscellaneous invoices, that is, those that are not attributed to purchase order lines, still get automatically created and submitted for approval by ARM, but obviously there won't be a matching process involved in those scenarios. If approval is required for an AP invoice, either because it has no associated prior approved purchase order attributed to it, or if the matching process resulted maybe in discrepancies which fell outside of a configured tolerance, then the necessary approvers would be notified and the approval process kicks into play. If approval is not required, then the AP invoice simply bypasses approval altogether and it's subsequently ready for posting and payment. Logging into my live environment now, I can see along the left-hand side that there are two menu options of note for today's tutorial. We have our AP invoices menu screen here, which shows us all of the AP invoices currently in the system, including the current statuses of each. And we also have this OCR dashboard that we talked about earlier. So when a document is scanned, the result of that scan enters the OCR dashboard, and either there will be exceptions that need to be handled, as was mentioned, there may be errors that need to be corrected, or hopefully everything is fine and we can essentially bypass this screen. But you can see on the OCR dashboard now that we have a number of invoices that have come through as the result of an AI OCR scan. We can see that some of these have warnings and errors associated with them. So for example, you can see there that some of the information on one of the lines is empty, and that this PO receipt number has actually already been, the PO receipt has already been invoiced. So in addition to showing you the result of the scan, there are also some security checks in this screen which just make sure that situations don't occur, like the double entering of an invoice, for example. So as we saw on the slides earlier, the first step would be to get our invoice or have that invoice feed into a worklist folder or some sort of inbox that the AI OCR solution is trained to look at. But I have my worklist folder, so if I open that up, currently there's nothing in there. But as I said before, the AI OCR solution is looking in this folder all the time. So I have an invoice here, a PDF version of an invoice, and I'll just quickly show you what that looks like. There's the invoice there, fairly generic. It's got some basic information, invoice numbers, vendors, totals, etc. And I am now going to drop this into the work list, and hopefully the AI OCR process will kick in automatically. Now, it's important to note here that this particular invoice is related to a purchase order that I have in my system in ARM. This purchase order has been received but not yet invoiced. And you can see here that it relates to purchase order number 4597. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drop this document into the worklist folder, 1, 2, 3, and you'll see that after a moment it will disappear and the scanning process will begin. Once the PDF is removed from the folder and the scanning has begun, you can come back into ARM, and if you have a look at the OCR dashboard, you will see that the scanning for that document is in process. And so there we go. It's currently processing that metadata. It's trying to identify certain fields, and based on what it sees, it's going to try and enter as much information as possible. So now that the scan has completed, you can see that the status indicator has changed. It's now showing exported, and this means that in this case, the data that was automatically created or scanned from that invoice is sufficient and has automatically created an invoice. But let's take a closer look within the OCR dashboard at what's occurred here. So when I click on 4597, which is my invoice, you can see a copy of the invoice on the right-hand side with all of the different detail there. You can also see on the left-hand side that thanks to the AI OCR process, ARM has been able to populate a lot of the fields that you would have previously entered manually, but it's done it automatically. So for example, we can see the vendor name, Bunzel, automatically entered. We can see the invoice number automatically entered. We can see the line detail has been automatically entered. And you can also see that as I float over each of these fields, a red box appears on the right-hand side showing me where the corresponding information was taken from on that PDF or where that scan is. Now, if that's actually incorrect, it can be changed in this folder, but in this case, everything has been done 100% correctly from what I can see. And so we are free to, if we were manually creating the invoice, we could create the invoice from here. Or as I said before, because there are no exceptions to be handled here, no errors, ARM has actually gone and created this invoice automatically. So if I go back now to the main screen and have a look at my AP invoices, what I should notice is that a new invoice should be there, 4597I, there it is. It's been automatically created. Let's open that up. And when I do so, I can see there's the invoice itself on the right-hand side. All the header information has been pre-populated on the left. I can also see that ARM has seen the purchase order number from the scan of the invoice. It has gone and searched for receipt lines or PO receipt lines attributed to that purchase order number. It's found them, it's imported them into the document, it has matched them against the invoice totals. There is no variance on this occasion, so it has then subsequently submitted that AP invoice for approval. Because there was no variance, because there was no discrepancy or variances outside of a tolerance, then approval has actually been completely bypassed on this occasion. And so the AI OCR engine has scanned the document, ARM has automatically populated that information, created the invoice for us, matched the invoice for us, submitted the invoice for us, and bypassed approval. So the stage we're at right now is that this invoice is approved, ready for posting and payment without anybody needing to touch it manually. In the second example, we're going to look briefly at the tolerance settings in ARM, and tolerances can determine when an invoice needs to trigger approval. And the reason this came about is we allow for certain variance between the invoice line and the PO receipt line, but only to a configured degree. Once it sets outside that agreed tolerance, then approval will trigger. So if I look at my tolerance settings here, I can see that I have AP invoice tolerances set up. And essentially what this is saying is that for the unit cost of any of my invoices versus their respective PO receipt line, if the values deviate or vary by more than 5% or $50, it could be either one or both, then what I want to have happen is I want to trigger approval. So imagine if you had a $1,000 invoice line that related to a purchase order line that was $998. Well, you probably wouldn't trigger approval based on that. But if it was a $3,000 invoice line when the purchase order receipt line said that it should have been $1,800, then that would be worthwhile sending through for reapproval. So the tolerances just allow you a little bit of flexibility and freedom. So not everything that has a variance has to be further investigated, but certainly it's within the tolerances that you set that determines when this is necessary. In this next example, I've created an invoice very much like the first one, but the difference is I've intentionally made the invoice lines of a higher value. The purchase order that this relates to has lines that are valued at $13.95 per unit. And again, I've intentionally changed this to $15.95 to show you what happens when those tolerances are breached. Okay, so opening the work list, dropping my new invoice into the work list. Now I can go back into ARM, and momentarily I should see the results of that scan in my OCR dashboard. Okay, so once the scan's complete, you can see that the indicators turn green. It says invoice submitted. That's slightly different to the first example. Let's find out why. So within my OCR dashboard, I'll click on this particular scan. I see my invoice down the right-hand side as before. All of the necessary fields are there, they're accurate enough and they're sufficient. And so ARM has enough detail to go ahead and automatically create the invoice. Okay, so now I go across to my AP invoices menu. I should see that AP invoice there. And there it is, and I can see that it has been submitted. So when I open this invoice up now, as before, we see the AP invoice on the right-hand side. We see all of the automatically populated fields on the left-hand side. The ARM system has also gone out and found the purchase order receipt lines, but as you can see, the invoice is charging $15.95 per line. The agreed value on the purchase order receipt line is $13.95. So this is not only a discrepancy, but a discrepancy which sits outside the 5% or $50 threshold that we configured as part of our ARM configuration. And so even though this invoice can be automatically generated and processed most of the way, once it gets submitted, it will trigger approval on this basis. And so as we can see there, we have Jen as our approver, who will now have received an email with instructions saying that she needs to approve this invoice. Once that invoice is approved, then we will finally be in the same position we were in the first example, where the invoice will be approved, ready for posting and ready for payment.